We need an airfield for an immediate landing. The fuel is at zero. A phrase that usually only sounds in simulators is cutting through the airwaves over northern India today. Behind the glass is a monolith of gray water and flashes. Under the wing is a city that seems to be hidden under a wet blanket. There is a lane ahead that cannot be seen, and there are minutes in the tanks, not hours. The paradox of this moment is that everything is bubbling outside, but inside the plane they try to keep museum silence. The smooth voice of the commander, the short answers of the co-pilot, checklists that sound like a verse learned before mechanics. The fuel scale melts in steps, every 55 kilograms per minute while waiting. Each new loop in the sky is -6 minutes of reserve. The radar draws purple walls of precipitation in front of your nose, as if someone has deployed a concrete fence in the sky. There is a chain of sides at the back. Everyone has their own calculation. Everyone has their own line of patience. The contrast is even more striking if you look back an hour and a half. A routine flight, a predictable route, a new A320 with economical CFM LEAP under the wing, neatly balanced refueling. What looks like a craft of precise numbers in the tables. And there is a trap hidden in this exact craft. The lighter you take, the less you burn, the more profitable you fly, as long as the weather doesn't require you to do what you voluntarily left on the platform in the form of extra kilograms of kerosene. There are two different scales of experience inside the cabin. A commander who has seen hundreds of approaches on the edge, and a co-pilot who learns to breathe evenly on the same edge. The system calls the CRM, task allocation and communication. Nature calls it something else, verification. A squall blows the course by a couple of degrees. A wet strip promises a long run, and the wind is ready to turn an accurate glide path into a rope over the water. The dispatcher says, 5 minutes and you'll be on your way. 5 minutes is a nice number for a queue. For tanks, it's half the remaining peace of mind. It seems that everything rests on the contours of the thunderstorm center, but in fact, on the contours of decisions. Where to keep the line of departure, when to say, we're leaving, and when, we'll make it. The nearest safe airfield beckons like an island, but airlines have their own priority map. Where there is their own technical support, where there are their own people, where it is easier to return the plane to the route. And this map sometimes draws a path longer than the fuel schedule allows. The passenger cabin is another world. There are more contrasts. Children's laughter through the roar of rain on the fuselage, the smell of coffee over the smell of wet air, soft music over the growl of compressors that greedily drive tons of air through the fans. The fasten your seatbelt sign has been on for so long that it has stopped being noticed. Brake flaps, icing, all these are consumers, and the fuel needle keeps count, like a subway where the train leaves every minute, and you're still on the escalator. But even the densest rain wall gives cracks. In weather reports, they are called a temporary improvement. In flight life, they are called a window. The problem is that windows like to slam shut at the moment when you're already on the trapeze. Just a little more heading control, one more touch of the thrust handle, one more look at the speed to make sure she didn't fly over the limit. And if you have to leave, you also need fuel, which is not enough even for an extra breath. This is where the main question of this story arises, like that of Jantopoulos. If on the one hand there are elements and risk, then on the other hand there are discipline and rules. If on the one hand there is a saving of kilograms, then on the other hand there is the price of a single circle. If on the one hand there is a paper alternate airfield, then on the other hand there is a real window in the sky where you will have to land here and now. At this moment, the whole country under the wing turns into a map of options, and almost every one of them is more expensive than the previous one. We'll start with this point of tension. The radio call-out, the wet streak, the squally wind, the seconds before a decision is made. And then rewind back to the beginning of the route, to the fuel bill and the forecast that promise clearance. To understand why the phrase, "we need an airfield immediately," has become not an exception to the rule, but the logical end of a chain of very rational, very professional, but dangerously optimistic steps. Mumbai has its own rhythm even in the monsoon. There's a wet sheen on the platform, as if the entire airport has just been hosed down. Unaccustomed to starting in such conditions, it seems like madness, but for Indian aviation it's everyday life. Dozens of flights per hour, thunder and lightning, which have long become background noise. Amid the noise at gate 23, passengers board. Someone flips through a newspaper, someone writes messages, Someone sees the cabin of the A320 for the first time and is surprised at how quiet it is. The plane itself still smells like new hardware, just a year after delivery. 2 CFM LEAP 1A turbines, the pride of the engine industry. Quieter, more economical, more efficient. They have thousands of hours of testing, kilometers of data, and millions of dollars of development. But on this day, their power will be balanced by a simple number on the fuel gauge. After all, the engine does not know that there is a storm outside. It does not care. It will eat kerosene exactly according to the norm without discounts and compromises. There are 2 people in the cabin. The captain is in his early 30s, but he's already had 8,000 hours on this model alone. For a pilot, it's like getting behind the wheel of a familiar car and knowing by ear when the bearing has slightly changed its tone. Next to him is the co-pilot, 28 years old, 1,500 hours, of which only a part is in the right seat of the Airbus. There is not only age between them, but also experience. One has heard hundreds of GPWS warnings in the simulator, and in reality, the other is still learning how to react correctly without losing his cool. Outside, it's an ordinary day on India's largest corridor, the Mumbai-Delhi flight. The flight is for a little over 2 hours, just a little over 1,000 kilometers. Hundreds of such boards per year, dozens per week. And that's why passengers see it as a routine. We'll be in the capital soon, someone in seat 14A thinks, while the flight attendant explains the rules for using the belt. But the routine is destroyed by contrast. At the same moment, a squall covers Delhi. Thunderclaps, lightning, heavy rain, visibility drops. Dispatchers are already preparing for delays. The queue for boarding is growing. In the air, where everything is calculated for seconds and tons, extra circles turn into drama. The irony is that on the ground in Mumbai, the crew still believes in the forecast. The storm should be gone by their arrival. And here the most interesting thing begins: fuel. Kerosene in aviation is both blood and money. 30% of the airline's expenses go here. You take more, the plane is heavier, it eats even more. If you take less, the savings are beautiful on paper, but the chances of maneuvering in the air become less. At the start, this choice seems like math. But in the sky, it turns into a survival ethic. Today, the crew lays 500 kilograms for taxiing, 4,000 kilograms for the flight itself, 200 kilograms for unforeseen deviations, plus a mandatory reserve for 30 minutes, 1,150 kilograms. And the internal norm of the company is another ton. Everything looks clear on paper, but when it comes to the alternative, the numbers suddenly become flexible. The dispatcher marks Ahmedabad and Lucknow as alternate airfields. According to the rules, take the fuel under the furthest one, that is, under Ahmedabad. That's almost 4 more tons on top. But the crew is looking at the forecast. The storm will go away, Delhi will accept, and if anything, Lucknow will be clear. And then a dilemma arises: why carry extra tons if they are likely to be unnecessary? This is where economics collides with meteorology. Here, the logic of the company, take less, meets the reality of the sky, where everything can change in 15 minutes. It is here, in the shadow of the wet Mumbai platform, that the very chain is laid, which in 3 hours will force the crew to pronounce the words Mayday on the air. The fuel bill in the hands of the crew looks dry and technical. Lines, numbers, signatures. But behind each figure is a decision that can turn into a matter of survival in the air. It all starts with simple things. 500 kilograms for taxiing, because even while the plane is traveling along the concrete paths to the start, the turbines are already pulling hundreds of kilograms of kerosene. Then the main flight, about 4,000 kilograms, plus 200 kilograms for small things, minor course deviations, cloud flying, and U-turns. Then comes the turn of the mandatory reserve, 1,150 kilograms for 30 minutes of additional flight. This is the legal minimum. It is fixed by the regulator. In addition to this, the company requires pouring about a ton more for inner peace. On paper, this system seems perfect. There is stock, the company is protected, and the numbers look strict. But now the word alternative appears on the horizon. Any flight must have an alternate airfield where it is possible to leave if landing is not possible at the main point. On clear days, you need one such option. in bad weather too. This time, the list includes Ahmedabad and Lucknow. This means that the crew must take enough fuel to reach even the farthest city, Ahmedabad. That's almost 4 extra tons. 4 tons, which will make the plane heavier, means it will require more kerosene, and the company's economic formula will become much less attractive. And then the main character and the main villain come on the scene at the same time, the forecast. The paper says, by the time of arrival, the thunderstorm over Delhi will have shifted. The sky will clear. As a last resort, Lucknow promises good weather. Ahmedabad looks like a redundant safety net. Against the background of these images, which inspire confidence, the solution seems obvious. Why carry 4 tons if everything goes smoothly without them? And then there's what the pilots call an accounting trick. The statement requires you to show a sufficient margin, but the actual calculation can be adjusted. The internal additional ton, which the company requires anyway, can be written as both a reserve and an alternative. As a result, everything is beautiful on paper. There is fuel for both Ahmedabad and Lucknow, but in fact, there is only enough fuel for the nearest option. 8,500 kilograms are poured into the tanks. This is less than would be required in a fair settlement with Ahmedabad. But there is a risk in this economy. Every ton that was not taken is dozens of minutes of flight, which will then cost nerves. The irony is that right now everyone is happy. The company is happy because the flight saves money, the crew is happy because they believe in the forecast. No one thinks that in a few hours every 100 kilograms will be the difference between landing and empty tanks. When the engines start and the liner leaves the platform, the fuel begins to disappear according to a predetermined formula. But everything that was saved in Mumbai will remain on Earth forever. At the start, everything looked promising. Forecasts assured that by the time of arrival, the storm over Delhi would shift, the sky would clear, and if precipitation remained, then only a light drizzle. The picture that the crew saw on paper was like something out of an advertising brochure. Neat clouds moving away to the northeast, the air corridors are free, and Delhi meets flights with a delay of a maximum of a few minutes. In such an atmosphere, the decision to take less fuel didn't just seem reasonable. It even seemed professional, backed up by accurate weather information. But in an hour and a half, everything changed. When the Airbus was already 150 kilometers closer to the capital, the weather service issued a new message. The thunderstorm did not go away, on the contrary, it intensified. Huge cumulonimbus clouds hung over the city. Thunderstorm columns rose to a height of tens of kilometers. The downpour intensified, and visibility dropped to 500 meters. For a car that requires at least 800 to 900 meters of visibility, this means one thing: landing is impossible. And as if confirming the forecast verdict, the dispatcher's voice sounded on the air. Vistara 944, take over the waiting area. This means, stay in the air, wait for your turn, do not approach the lane. It would seem to be a formality. Such holdings happen every day all over the world. But on this day, every minute of waiting turned into kilograms of fuel, leaving irretrievably. The plane makes its first lap. The fuel indicator shows 4,900 kilograms. The second round is 4,600. The third one is already 4,300. Each turn costs 6 minutes and minus 300 kilograms. And all this for the sake of the hope that in 5 minutes everything will improve. But these 5 minutes repeat over and over again, turning into a vicious circle. Tension is building in the cabin. The co-pilot, seeing the dwindling reserve, according to textbooks, should have already insisted on leaving for an alternate airfield. But in reality, another rule works. The commander decides, and the young pilot is more often silent. This is called the gradient of power, an invisible wall that prevents the younger from challenging the decision of the elder. And while the arrows are creeping down, silence in the right-hand seat becomes another risk factor. Meanwhile, the numbers are getting relentless. There is no longer enough fuel to reach Ahmedabad, which is listed on paper as a reserve city. Lucknow is still within reach, but it's eating up the last chance. And here a paradox arises. If they had taken an honest stock back in Mumbai, now the solution would be simple: a course to Ahmedabad and a quiet landing. But when every 100 kilograms counts, the choice turns into a roulette wheel. The storm is not going to go away over Delhi. The downpour is only getting worse, and lightning is breaking out more often. And the crew has to make a decision on which depends on where to send the liner, to take risks in the capital or to seek salvation in Lucknow. Every minute in the waiting area is a paradoxical theater. Outside, the storm roars. Inside the cabin, everything is just as dry and businesslike. The autopilot keeps the car on the oval. The pilots read the checklists. The dispatcher promises over and over again, 5 more minutes. But the fuel gauge on the panel turns this expectation into a countdown. The Airbus A320 uses about 55 kilograms of kerosene per minute in standby mode. This means that each 6-minute lap consumes 330 kilograms. On the flow chart, a thin arrow seems to lick off the numbers one by one. The commander glances at the readings, 4,200, 4,100, and realizes, here it is, the very border beyond which any alternate airfield turns into a luxury. The co-pilot sees it all too. He was taught that if the forecast does not come true, and the fuel runs out faster, you need to insist on leaving. But it's not technology that comes into play here, but psychology. In aviation, it is called the power gradient, the difference in authority between the captain and his assistant. To say, we have to leave, is to question the decision of the senior, the one with thousands of hours of flight time. And it's not easy, especially when the atmosphere in the cockpit is already tense. As a result, only the commander's voice is heard on the air, and there is silence next to it. Meanwhile, in the real world, things continue to narrow down. Ahmedabad is too far away. The paper lifeline is now useless. Lucknow is still possible, but every extra circle turns it into a ghost. The longer the wait over Delhi drags on, the less likely it is to fly somewhere else. And all this happens under constant contrast. The passengers in the cabin think that the delay due to the weather is a matter of habit. Someone is looking out the window at the lightning. Someone is listening to music with headphones. They don't know that the 5 minutes the dispatcher is talking about have already stolen dozens of kilometers of a possible route from them. In the cockpit, the captain calculates the remainder aloud. 1 more lap and we'll go all the way to Lucknow. This phrase is hanging in the air, but no decision has been made yet. The dispatcher promises again that the entrance is about to open, and the crew keeps the car in the oval again. This is how the point of no return is formed. If they don't leave now, then each option will only get worse. But the dispatcher's voice still sounds confident, and the system has trained pilots to trust the tower, and the captain chooses to stay for now. On the dashboard, the numbers add up to a formula that leaves no room for imagination. To safely reach Lucknow, you need at least 3.5 tons. Anything below that is already a risk. And now the arrow stops exactly at this mark. In textbooks, this is called the decision point. If the stock drops to the estimated minimum, the plane must leave. But reality rarely matches the textbook. It is at this moment that the dispatcher from Delhi gets in touch. Vistara 944, descent is allowed. We're expecting a possible approach in 40 miles. 40 miles is a 15-minute flight. 15 minutes is the time they almost don't have. It's a temptation too tempting to refuse. The capital is nearby, passengers are waiting for arrival, and the forecast promises at least a tiny window in the storm. The commander quickly evaluates. If the entry succeeds, we are at home. If not, we'll go to Lucknow. But in fact, you won't be able to leave anymore. With 3.5 tons in tanks, the airfield in Lucknow remains achievable only in theory, without additional U-turns and without the right to make mistakes. Any maneuver, any delay, and the numbers turn into a minus. The co-pilot watching the fuel understands this. His glance at the instruments betrays alarm, but the words do not sound. The gradient of power is triggered again. The decision remains with the captain. And the captain decides to go to Delhi, despite the fact that the rules require otherwise. This is the point of no return. At this point, the crew stops playing chess with multiple options. Now there is only one line left. Either they will be able to land in Delhi, or they will no longer be able to leave. The irony is that this decision seems logical, even justified, because Delhi is only a few minutes away. But every minute in the air now costs more than a ton of fuel at launch. The dispatcher confirms. Vistara 944, heading in, lane 29. The captain puts the car into a descent. There is still a white pall outside the window, heavy rain and a squally wind. There are only 3.4 tons in the tanks and much less. All attention is now focused on one lane in the heart of the metropolis, which may not show through the rain. The course is set. The plane slowly descends through the layers of the storm curtain. The sensors indicate a strong headwind, which suddenly changes to a tailwind. For pilots, it's like playing a piano, where each key can suddenly turn into a different note. The speed jumps, the glide path breaks, and the automation barely has time to adjust. Only flashes of lightning are visible through the glass of the cabin. At some point, a ghostly light appears on the horizon. These are the lights of the strip. For a few seconds, the crew has hope. Just a little more and they are on the ground. But it is at this moment that a gust of tailwind throws the liner higher and further than necessary. The aircraft ceases to meet the requirements of the stabilized approach, the golden rule that prohibits landing if the car is not sitting exactly in the corridor. The commander makes an instant decision: withdrawal to the second round. Thrust levers forward, nose up, landing gear and flaps retracted. The Airbus roars back into the sky, and the fuel gauge shows 3,200 kilograms. This means that on the second attempt you will have to sit down at all costs. There is no reserve for the third one anymore. And that's where the cruel irony of the situation comes in. If they had an honest supply for Ahmedabad, they could safely go there. If they had left the waiting area earlier, they could have safely flown to Lucknow. But now, after one failed attempt, there was no choice left. The dispatcher records the departure and asks about the intentions. The commander responds, Vistara 944, we are leaving for Lucknow. This means that from now on they will no longer return to Delhi. But the fuel is already less than the minimum calculation for Lucknow. And although the decision has been made, it is like jumping across a river, where a couple of steps may not be enough to reach the other bank. The plane turns to the east. There are 2,850 kilograms left in the tanks. This is barely enough for one approach to Lucknow and a small margin for maneuver. The situation stops being routine and turns into a race against the countdown. Every minute of flight is now measured not in kilometers, but in chances: one chance to enter, one chance to land, one chance to escape. A turn to the east seems to open a new window of opportunity, but in reality this window is narrow and shaky. As the crow flies, Lucknow is only 200 kilometers away, but a straight line in the sky is rarely available. Storm pockets obscure the course, and pilots have to avoid them in wide arcs. Every deviation means extra miles and tens of kilograms of kerosene. Soon there is another obstacle on the way: the restricted area of the military airfield near Agra. To get there means to violate the airspace, which can have serious consequences. To avoid both the thunderstorm and the zone, the crew has to make a detour of 40 miles. Once again, the fuel is melting faster than expected. The indicator is already showing about 2,000 kilograms. At this point, the dispatcher offers a saving option. Vistara 944, do you want to leave for Jaipur? The weather is clear there. The lane is clear. Jaipur is closer, more accessible and safer. But the crew's response is different. Negative, our backup is Lucknow. This phrase reflects the whole system. There are two types of alternate airfields in aviation. Suitable ones are those where the company has technical support, its own staff, and ground handling. And acceptable ones are those that can formally accept an airplane, but where the airline does not have the infrastructure. Jaipur is just in the second category. On paper, it is listed as a spare, but in reality, no one planned to use it. This becomes a psychological trap. For years, pilots have seen such acceptable airfields as just a formality, a string for the regulator. And when the dispatcher calls Jaipur, they mentally discard this option without even analyzing it. The instinct to land where it's safer recedes before the corporate logic of flying to where our own people are waiting for us. Meanwhile, the fuel continues to decrease. 1,800 kilograms, 1,700. With these figures, you can now buy only one landing attempt. Everything that seemed like a reliable reserve in Mumbai has turned into a restless remnant. And if they had accepted Jaipur's offer, the car would have been on the ground in 20 minutes. But instead, the course remains towards Lucknow, deep into the storm front. There, ahead, behind a dense curtain of lightning and rain, an airfield awaits, which on paper looked like a salvation, but in reality may turn out to be a new trap. Lucknow is getting closer, but the storm is gathering with it. The weather forecast, which promised clarity this morning, now shows a different picture. Heavy rain, thunderstorms, and heavy winds. The plane enters the landing zone, and the dispatcher reports. Visibility is 675 meters. This is already a wake. Up call at least 800 meters for the Airbus A320. After a couple of minutes, a new message arrives, 475 meters. Landing is now officially impossible, but there is no luxury of choice in the cabin. The reserve in the tanks is only 1,200 kilograms. This means a maximum of one full-fledged visit and no plan B. The commander leads the liner down, hoping that visibility will suddenly improve. The co-pilot scans the instruments, announcing the altitude. 2,000 feet, nothing, just gray rain. 1,000 feet, there are still no strip lights. 500 feet is zero. And then the decisive phrase sounds, "We interrupt the approach." Thrust levers forward. The plane goes back into the sky. But this is not the same confident departure that was in Delhi. Now it's a desperate attempt to gain minutes. During this maneuver, another 250 kilograms are burned, and only 1,100 remain on the indicator. The commander makes a risky decision. Not to climb high, but to stay low in order to turn around faster for the second approach. But low altitude has a price. Fuel consumption is dramatically higher. Now every minute consumes even more than in the train. A yellow warning flashes on the panel. Min fuel. This is a signal that they have reached a critical balance. The phrase goes off the air. Vistara 944. We have a minimum supply. Priority is required. The dispatcher confirms that they are first in line. But the weather doesn't follow priorities. The downpour does not think to subside. Visibility is in no hurry to rise. There's another run ahead, but there's only enough fuel for a few minutes. In the cabin, passengers feel turbulence. Someone presses their nails into the armrests. Someone closes their eyes. They don't know the numbers on the panel, but they can feel every jerky movement of the car. The irony is that 50 kilometers away there is a Prayagrad airfield with the best weather. But it is not in the database of the onboard computer. There are no maps in the cockpit. To try there is to fly blindly without tools. And there is no more time for experiments. The numbers on the panel drop below 700 kilograms. That's less than a 15-minute flight. Every flash of lightning outside the window seems to emphasize that if the second visit to Lucknow fails, there will be no options left. Lucknow refuses to open the lane. The second run in the same gray wall of rain ends in nothing. The runway is still invisible. About 650 kilograms remain in the tanks, less than a quarter of a ton for each engine. That's a 12-minute flight. Not a reserve, not a buffer, but a counter that goes down without pause. The crew is looking for at least some kind of option. Kanpur is very close, but there is no instrument system, which means that the entry will be blind. In a thunderstorm, it's akin to playing roulette. Another option is Prayagrad. There are modern systems there, and the weather is better, but there is no airport in the aircraft base. There are no charts, maps, or data in the navigation computer. Flying there means being guided by old-fashioned radio beacons, as if in the middle of the last century, and even in turbulence that takes the car off course. An alarm call sounds in the cockpit. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Vistara 944, running out of fuel. Immediate boarding is required. It's not just words, it's a red line. When the mayday sounds for fuel, it means a few more minutes and the engines will start to stall one by one. And while the liner is rolling along the slippery strip of Lucknow, it seems that the thunderstorm has become quieter around. But in fact, it only got quieter in the cockpit, because their race against time was finally over. The wheels of the A320 beat on the wet lane. The roar of the reverse merges with the noise of the downpour. The plane rushes along the runway, raising fountains of water behind it, like a boat at takeoff speed. In the cockpit, the pilots look at the runway no less than at the instruments, any aquaplaning, any sideways demolition, and an emergency exit beyond the concrete. But the chassis is being held, the braking system is working, and the ABS automation prevents the wheels from locking even on a puddle-covered surface. Nevertheless, the fuel meter remains the main device. 260 kilograms is about 5 minutes of flight on both engines. So little that even taxiing to parking at large airports can take longer. The pilots know perfectly well that they boarded literally at the last possible minute. If the approach had dragged on for another lap, or if it had been necessary to go into the clouds, the tanks would have been empty, and the two modern turbofan engines would have turned into fixed metal cylinders. There is a sigh of relief in the cabin, although many passengers do not even realize how close everything was. For them, the landing was simply with turbulence and delay. Someone applauds, someone calls their relatives, someone jokes that the monsoon has shown its mettle again. But in the cockpit, the crew sits in silence for a few more minutes. There was too much tension, too many decisions hanging in the balance. The irony is that the landing itself turned out to be almost flawless, on the first attempt in conditions where many aircraft would prefer to go to a backup. The car is held on the axle, the mileage is correct, the brakes are maintained. But this beauty of flight hides a terrible statistic: 5 minutes between flight and complete loss of engines. When the plane clears the runway and rolls out onto the taxiway, the dispatcher finally says in a calm voice, "Vistara 944, welcome to Lucknow." Only now does the crew allow themselves a short sigh. Their work has been completed, but along with it, the work of other people will begin. Inspectors who will analyze their every decision, every figure in the statement, every word on the radio. 5 minutes to empty tanks. That's how much separated 161 people from another story that could end up in the disaster chronicles. When the plane stopped in the parking lot, the storm seemed to fade into the background. For the first time in several hours, the cabin was filled not with the sounds of sirens and negotiations, but simply with silence. But with this silence came another reality: reports, commissions, inspections. In India, such cases are not ignored. Pilots are automatically suspended from flights while experts analyze what happened and who is to blame. In the early days, the media headlines were based on a simple contrast: experienced captain, young co-pilot, empty tanks. It would seem that the conclusion was obvious: the crew's mistake. But when the experts began to delve into the details, it became clear that the chain was much more complicated. The commission found that the pilots had not directly violated any rules. They acted according to the forecast, which was officially approved. They met the fuel requirements. On paper, the numbers matched. They chose alternate airfields, just as the control department had taught them. Even going to the second round was correct. The lane really turned out to be out of parameters at that moment. And here the main problem appeared. The system worked exactly as it was intended. Fuel economy was considered a virtue. Acceptable alternate airfields were indicated only for reporting. Forecasts were accepted as a guide to action, and the hierarchy in the cockpit rarely allowed the co-pilot to challenge the commander's decision aloud. All these elements were not violations, but together they formed a trap that almost closed. Regulators quickly realized that this was not an accidental mistake, but a systemic pattern. That's why the crew was returned to flying after a week of suspension. There were no formal culprits, because every part of the chain was correct. But that was exactly the tragicomedy. A set of right steps almost led to death. The flight ended successfully for the passengers. For the company, this has become a lesson that cannot be silenced. But the main question that hangs in the air is, if the system gives such results with perfect adherence to the rules, then who should be punished? Those who follow the instructions, or those who create these instructions? And while the experts were arguing, one thing remained obvious. Vistara 944 showed that a disaster can be born not from one gross violation, but from dozens of small compromises, each of which individually looks logical. The story of Flight 944 revealed a vulnerability that aviation knew about, but preferred not to say out loud. Strict rules combined with economic compromises create the illusion of security until nature reminds us who is in charge in the sky. The first conclusion made by the investigators concerned alternate airfields. Paper-based, acceptable options like Jaipur should cease to be a formality. If the airfield is listed as an alternate one, it means that you can actually go there at any time. With maps, with fuel, with support. Otherwise, this line turns into self-deception. The second conclusion is related to fuel. Saving for the sake of accountability should not overshadow common sense. The additional stock should be calculated not as a convention, but as a real insurance. Let it add costs, but the cost of saving is measured too expensively in human lives. Several hundred kilograms of fuel can cost millions of dollars in the event of a disaster, and it is this ratio that must be kept in mind during every planning process. The third lesson is culture in the cockpit. The power gradient that makes the co-pilot silent when it comes to arguing is a hidden threat. Companies should teach young officers not only techniques, but also the courage to say, "We have to leave." And Kapitanov should take these words not as a challenge to authority, but as an additional security tool. The fourth point is forecasts. Aviation has long relied on the accuracy of weather services, but in an era of rapid climate change, relying on just one forecast is dangerous. We need to develop nowcasting, a system that updates the picture in real time, rather than promising a light up in a couple of hours. Finally, the system should stop punishing crews for safety decisions. If a pilot chooses the nearest airfield, even if it is not ours, this should be considered the right step, and not a reason for reports. This is the only way to build a culture where the priority is to plant people alive, rather than saving a ton of kerosene. Flight 944 ended safely, but it wasn't the system that saved him, but a miracle in the form of a temporary window in the storm. And this is the main conclusion. Aviation has no right to rely on miracles. She must build processes so that miracles are not required. And if this story seems incredible, then the next one is even scarier. It's not the thunderstorm or the fuel that has become the enemy. The danger was born right in the cockpit. This is the story of Germanwings 9525, and it will prove that sometimes the biggest threat to flight is not behind the clouds, but in the co-pilot's seat. The Vista 944 plane stopped at the gate in Lucknow, and the passengers went about their business, not even realizing how close they were to the tragedy. In their eyes, it was just another flight, slightly marred by the weather and delays. But for those who sat in the cockpit, this night will forever remain a reminder. Sometimes a chain of right decisions can lead to the edge of the abyss. This story has shown us that miracles happen in aviation. But more importantly, aviation should be designed in such a way that there is no need for miracles, so that pilots always have a choice, dispatchers have real options, and passengers have confidence that their flight will end not by a happy coincidence, but because the system is working reliably. And if the enemy here was a storm and empty tanks, then in the next story the enemy will be much closer. Where the passengers were waiting for a quiet flight, a tragedy was born in the very heart of the cabin. Germanwings Flight 9525 began as a routine flight, but ended in a way that forever changed the idea of what a pilot can be devoted to. This story will be the next chapter of our conversation. And believe me, it will be impossible to forget her.